The basement of the Ashmont Hotel was where Garrett Vance preferred to do his work. The night shift, fewer witnesses, and the most powerless people in the building all funneled down here. That night, he cornered Maren Holt right at the storeroom door. "You tore this. It's coming out of your pay." He held up a frayed tablecloth, though they both knew he was lying. "I didn't tear it." Her voice was hoarse after her third shift in a row. Garrett stepped closer and lowered his voice. "What's the word of a maid worth, anyway? You're drowning in debt, with a little sister lying in a hospital bed. If I say you stole something, who's going to believe you?" The words struck an old wound. She had been falsely accused once before, and lost everything for it. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned. She didn't want to cry in front of him, but her exhausted body no longer obeyed her. She left the cart behind and ran. She threw herself into the service elevator and hit the top button, wanting only to go high, somewhere no one could find her. Tears blurred the lights. When the doors opened, she rushed out, head down. She didn't see the polished marble floor. She didn't see the two men in black suits standing guard like figures carved from stone. She had no idea she had just run straight onto the penthouse floor where someone like her was never allowed to set foot. All she registered was that she had slammed into a wall, but the wall was warm, and it was breathing. Two hands closed around her arms, steadying her before she fell, startlingly gentle. Yet the man's body stayed as still as a lake right before a storm. Around her, the guards moved as one, hands slipping inside their jackets. I'm sorry," she stammered, stepping back quickly. But he didn't let go. Maren looked up, tears still clinging to her lashes, and met a pair of eyes so dark they seemed to have no bottom. She had just fallen into the arms of the most dangerous man in Seattle, the man who owned this very building, and every dark secret it concealed. And for the first time in many years, something stirred behind the cold gaze of Roan Whitaker. If this story moved you, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that makes you believe in kindness again. Maren tried to pull her hand free from that restraint, but the man's fingers didn't loosen even a little. He didn't grip her hard, he didn't hurt her, and yet she still felt as though she was being held more tightly than anything that had ever bound her life before. The bodyguards remained exactly where they were, alert and tense, their hands resting lightly inside their coats, their eyes sweeping across the hallway as if they were waiting for the smallest sound before they acted. No one dared move before that man spoke. The entire penthouse floor was so silent that Maren could hear the frantic rhythm of her own heart. She knew she didn't belong in this place. She knew she had just crossed a boundary that people like her were never allowed to step over. And yet what made her tremble wasn't the men dressed in black. It was the gaze of the man holding her. Roan tilted his head slightly, studying her the way a person might look at something that had appeared outside every calculation. His face revealed no emotion, but his eyes were different. In that brief instant, something passed through them, something even he didn't have time to name. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was low, even, not loud, but it carried a weight that made the question sound like an order that couldn't be refused. It was the kind of voice that belonged to a man who had never had to repeat himself twice. Maren swallowed hard. Her reason told her to stay silent, to jerk herself free and run, but her body betrayed her reason once again. "Maren," she answered, the word nearly nothing more than a breath. Maren Holt. He didn't repeat that name. He simply recorded it somewhere deep inside himself, as if placing something precious into a locked drawer. His eyes moved over her rumpled uniform, over her shoes with their worn-down soles, over the tears that hadn't yet dried on her cheeks. But there was no contempt in that gaze, nor was there the pity she was so used to having thrown in her face by others. He only looked at her, as if he were trying to read a story written in a language he hadn't seen in a very long time. "I'm sorry," she repeated, clearer this time. "I didn't mean to come up here. I'll leave right away." He still said nothing more, and his silence only made her more flustered. At last, almost reluctantly, his fingers loosened. Maren stepped back once, then twice, her eyes still fixed on him as though she feared that the moment she turned away, something terrible would come crashing down on her. She fumbled for the elevator button behind her back, her hand trembling so badly that she had to try twice before she found it. When the metal doors slid open, she almost stumbled inside, her chest rising and falling, her heart pounding as if it might burst. In the final instant before the doors closed, she still saw him standing there in the stone-floored hallway, tall and motionless, watching her with those dark, fathomless eyes. Then the doors shut, and she leaned back against the elevator wall, slowly sliding down, both hands covering her face. She didn't understand what had just happened. She only knew she had to get out of this building as quickly as she could. Up on the penthouse floor, Roan remained standing still for a long while after the elevator had carried her away. One of his men stepped closer, his voice lowered with cautious restraint. "Sir, she saw too much. Do you want us to handle it?" The question was spoken calmly, as if he were asking about the weather, and that very calmness showed what kind of orders this man had grown used to hearing. Roan didn't answer at once. He slowly refastened the button of his suit jacket that had been knocked out of place when she ran into him, his eyes still fixed on the elevator doors that had already closed. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft that his subordinate had to lean in to hear it, but every word was as cold as steel. "No one is to touch her." The man froze, startled. This wasn't the answer he had expected, and he was wise enough not to ask anything more. He only lowered his head and stepped back to his old position. "Find out who she is," Roan continued, still not taking his eyes off the place where she had disappeared, "and find out who just made her cry." The hallway sank back into silence. No one dared ask why. In Roan Whitaker's world, an order didn't need a reason, and the fear in the eyes of the people standing around him said everything about what it meant to obey him. Marin's apartment lay deep below ground, a damp basement room in an old building on the south side of the city, where daylight could only slip in through a small window close to the ceiling, and the footsteps of people on the sidewalk always echoed down like the steady tapping of another world she didn't belong to. She got home when it was nearly dawn, her body still trembling after everything that had happened at the hotel. She locked the door, leaned back against the wall, and let the familiar cold of the room pull her back into reality. On the rickety wooden table in the corner sat a stack of papers she had memorized down to every number, hospital bills piled one on top of another, each sheet a month she hadn't been able to pay, each figure a night she had lain awake calculating. Rent was nearly due, the electric bill was already overdue, and the hospital debt kept growing larger like a shadow she could never escape. The night shift housekeeping job at Ashmont was all she had, a fragile job that could vanish in a single morning with one false accusation from Garrett Vance, and she knew that better than anyone. She sat down on the edge of the bed, took out her phone, and for the first time in that long night, the corner of her mouth lifted into a faint smile. On the screen was the face of her little sister, Pia, 9 years old, lying in a hospital bed with the yellow knit hat Marin had made for her last winter. A nurse had sent her a short video from that afternoon, and in it, Pia was showing off the picture she had just drawn, a little house with a chimney, the two sisters holding hands in front of the door, and an enormous sun colored with an orange crayon. "Sis, when are you coming to take me home?" Pia's clear little voice rang from the small speaker. "We're going to make cookies, right? You promised." Marin pressed the phone to her chest, closed her eyes, and let those words warm her from the inside, warmer than any heater that this basement room would never have. The little girl was the only reason she was still standing, the thin but unbreakable thread that tied her to life whenever she thought she couldn't go on. She sent her sister a message. "I promise. Sleep well, my little princess." Then set the phone down and looked up at the small window near the ceiling, where the sky was slowly turning the silver gray of dawn. It was in quiet moments like that when old memories found their way back, the memories she always tried to bury deep but had never truly been able to erase. 3 years earlier, she had worked as a maid for a wealthy family in the suburbs, a decent job with enough pay for her to dream of a different future. Until the day the mistress of the house discovered that a jade necklace had vanished from the bedroom, and everyone's eyes immediately fell on her, the poorest maid, the easiest to suspect, the easiest to accuse. No one asked her a single question. No one gave her a chance to explain. Her word, the word of a hired girl with no money and no standing, didn't weigh as much as a speck of dust compared with the words of the people sitting in that marble-floored living room. She was fired that same day, marked down as someone untrustworthy, and that label followed her everywhere, slamming one door after another shut in her face. It wasn't until half a year later that they found the necklace caught behind a drawer, but by then no one cared enough to apologize to her, and her honor had already been shattered beyond repair. She had learned a bitter lesson in those months, that in this world, the truth of the poor carried no weight, and once a person had been backed into a corner, there was nothing left to lose, nothing left to fear. Perhaps that was why tonight, when Garrett had stood before her with that familiar threat, something inside her no longer knew how to bow its head. 2 days later, In the office on the highest floor of the Whitaker building in downtown Seattle, Roan sat behind a broad desk of dark wood, his eyes resting on the thin file his man had just placed before him. Marcus Bell, the man who had followed him for many years and rarely revealed any emotion, stood straight on the other side of the desk, waiting. "Her full name is Maren Holt, 27 years old," Marcus began, his voice as steady as if he were reading an ordinary report. "She's been working the night shift as a housekeeper at Ashmont for nearly a year. She lives alone in a basement apartment on the south side of the city. No family except a little sister." Roan turned the pages one by one, his eyes unhurried, yet missing nothing. "The little sister?" he asked, his voice low. "Pia Holt, 9 years old," Marcus replied. "She's receiving long-term treatment at the Central Hospital. The expenses are very high, and Miss Holt is the only one carrying all of it. Their parents died in an accident many years ago, leaving the two sisters to fend for themselves. She worked 2 jobs for a long time to pay the hospital bills, but the debt kept growing." Roan said nothing. He only continued reading, and when he turned to the final page, his gaze lingered there longer. "There's one more thing," Marcus went on, and this time his voice lowered slightly. 3 years ago, she worked as a maid for a wealthy family. She was accused of stealing a piece of jewelry and fired immediately, even though there wasn't any evidence. Only much later did they find the missing item, but by then she had carried that stain on her name for a long time and had been turned away everywhere. In the room, only the steady ticking of the clock on the wall remained. Roan closed the file, placed his hand on the desktop, and for a long moment said nothing at all. Marcus knew that when his boss fell silent like that, it was best not to speak, so he simply stood still and waited. What Marcus couldn't see was what was moving behind Roan's dark eyes. The name Maren Holt, the image of a young woman abandoned by the whole world simply because she had no money, no voice, and no one standing on her side, all of it brushed against some deep place inside him that he had believed, for a very long time, was sealed shut completely. There was something in her story that reminded him of a child from years ago, a child who had also been trampled by the world simply because he had been born on the wrong side of the city, a child who had learned to survive by becoming harder than every person who had ever hurt him. He didn't allow himself to think any deeper about it, because those memories belonged to a person he had buried long ago in order to become the man sitting here today. But the feeling was still there, uninvited, a strange warmth slipping through the layer of ice he had spent many years building around himself. "How much does she owe the hospital?" he asked, his voice still calm. Marcus stated the amount, and it was a number large enough to drown an entire life like Maren's. Roan gave a very slight nod. "Take care of it," he said, quietly. "Don't let her know who did it." Marcus was momentarily surprised, though he was professional enough not to let it show on his face. In all the years he had worked for Roan Whitaker, he had watched this man bring down empires and force powerful men to their knees, but he had never once seen him be moved by a stranger, and he had certainly never seen him give without demanding anything in return. "Sir," he still asked cautiously, "what do you want from her?" Roan stood, walked toward the great glass window overlooking the city as its lights began to rise below, and clasped his hands behind his back. "Nothing," he replied, and it was the truth. A truth that felt strange even to him. This time, he wanted nothing at all. He simply didn't want to watch one more person collapse in a way no one should ever have to endure. The next morning, the employee break room in the basement of Ashmont was more crowded than usual, because it was shift change, when the night workers were getting ready to leave, and the day shift had just arrived. Maren was straightening her supply cart when Garrett Vance walked in, and the way he slammed the door alone was enough to make the entire room fall silent. He held a sheet of paper in his hand and waved it in front of everyone, as if he were displaying proof of a crime. "Someone reported a missing watch from a room on the 12th floor, he said loudly, his eyes aimed straight at Maren, "and the housekeeper assigned there last night was you, Holt." Maren looked up, stunned. "I didn't enter any room outside my assigned section," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm, even though her heart had begun to pound. Garrett gave a scornful laugh and stepped closer, savoring every second of the attention from the people around them. "Here we go again," he said, his voice filled with false pity. "What else can you expect from a servant girl who was once fired for stealing? I told them already. Keeping someone like you here would cause trouble sooner or later." The whole room went still. A few people lowered their heads and didn't dare look, while others stepped back as if they were afraid the disaster might spread to them. Maren felt her face burn, Not from shame, but from outrage. The outrage of a person who knew she was innocent, and yet had been forced back into the very corner she had once been pushed into 3 years ago. She opened her mouth to speak, but Garrett cut her off, throwing the paper onto the floor right in front of her feet. "Pick it up," he ordered. "This is your suspension notice. You're dismissed as of today, and don't dream that anyone will write you a letter of recommendation." Just as Marin bent down, a voice rang out from the doorway, low and calm, yet powerful enough to freeze the entire room solid. "I think you're the one who should pick it up, Vance." Every gaze turned toward the door, and Marin turned as well, only for her breath to catch halfway in her throat. The man she had run into on the penthouse floor that night was standing there, dressed in a flawless dark suit, both hands tucked into his trouser pockets, his manner so unhurried that it seemed as though this entire building rested in the palm of his hand, and the truth was, it did. Garrett spun around, and the moment he recognized who had just walked in, every trace of arrogance on his face vanished in an instant. "Mr. Whitaker," he stammered, his complexion shifting from red to deathly pale. I didn't know you were coming down here." Roan walked in at an easy pace, each footstep sounding evenly against the tile floor, and the crowd automatically parted to make way for him the way water parts before the bow of a ship. He stopped in front of Garrett, bent down to pick up the notice, glanced over it once, then tore it in half with effortless calm and let the 2 pieces fall to the floor. "I reviewed the security footage from the 12th floor last night," he said, his voice not rising even slightly, but so cold it made people shiver. "Miss Holt never set foot in that room. The only person who went in and out of it last night was you, Vance." Shocked murmurs rippled through the room. Garrett opened his mouth to defend himself, but not a single word came out. "I don't like strong men preying on the weak in my building," Roan continued, each word clear and sharp, as if nailing itself into the air. "You've been pressuring the employees under you for a long time, and you thought that because they were poor, because they had no one backing them, they would stay silent forever. You were wrong." He leaned toward Garrett, lowering his voice just enough for him and those closest to hear. "Pack your things. You're fired. And if I hear your name mentioned at any other hotel in this city, you'll understand what it truly means to have no way out." Garrett trembled, sweat beading across his forehead, then lowered his head and dragged himself out of the room, beneath the eyes of all the people he had once oppressed. Once he was gone, Roan turned to Marin, and for the first time, his gaze softened a little. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Marin was still stunned, her mouth dry, and it took her a moment before she could speak. "You," she whispered, "you own this place." Something flickered through his eyes, and he only gave a slight nod before a man named Marcus stepped up and murmured in his ear about an appointment with someone named Sloane Brant, waiting upstairs, causing his expression to darken for the briefest moment. The appointment with the man named Sloane Brant apparently could wait, because Roan didn't leave right away. Instead, he signaled for Marcus to step back, then turned to Marin and told her he wanted to speak with her privately for a few minutes. She was led up to a small sitting room on the mezzanine floor, a place quieter and more elegant than anywhere she had ever been allowed to step into inside this building, and she stood there with both hands clenched together, still wearing her housekeeping uniform, feeling as out of place as an ink stain spreading across white cloth. Roan poured her a glass of water, set it gently on the table in front of her, then sat down in the chair opposite her with the unhurried bearing of a man who had never had to rush for anyone. "I have an offer for you," he said. "My hotel needs someone to manage the employee lounge area, a respectable position with pay many times higher than what you're making now. I think you can do it." Marin looked up at him, and instead of the relief that someone in her situation should have felt, there was wariness in her eyes. "Why?" she asked directly. "Why would you do this for someone you've only met twice? A housekeeper you don't owe anything to?" Roan lifted his brow slightly, seeming surprised by the question, or perhaps surprised that she dared to ask it. "Most people would simply say thank you," he replied. "I'm not most people," Marin said. "I've learned that when someone gives away something too big for free, it's usually because they want to take back something even bigger. I have nothing to give, Mr. Whitaker, so I don't understand what you want." The room fell silent for a moment, and in that silence, Roan looked at her with a different kind of gaze, searching, touched with something almost like amusement, because it had been a very long time since anyone had sat across from him and dared speak to him this way. Other people who entered this room trembled, flattered him, and tried to guess what he wanted to hear so they could say it, while the woman before him looked straight into his eyes and asked her question as though he owed her an explanation. You don't trust me, he said, not as a question, but as an observation. I don't trust anyone who has more power than I do, she answered. Power doesn't give anything away for free. Roan leaned back slightly in his chair. You're right, he admitted, and his frankness made her pause for a moment. Power usually doesn't give anything away for free, but have you ever considered that someone might once have stood exactly where you're standing now? Might once have been accused while no one would listen, might once have been treated as though his words weren't worth as much as another person's breath. Marin went still, because that was exactly what she had lived through, and she didn't understand why this man could say it as if he understood it from the inside. I don't need your pity, she said softly, her voice still firm, though less guarded than before. I've lived through worse things than being framed by a man like Garrett, and I still managed to get back on my feet by myself. I won't take a job just because someone feels sorry for me. This isn't pity, Roan said, and this time his voice carried a seriousness that made her pay attention. This is because I just watched someone do the one thing no one else in this entire building dared to do, which was to stand with her back straight in front of someone stronger. A person like that deserves to do more than push a supply cart in the basement. Marin stayed silent for a long while, her heart pulled between the pride that wouldn't allow her to accept a favor and the cruel reality that she was drowning in debt. At last, she stood and picked up her old bag. Thank you for speaking honestly, she said, but I need to take care of my life in my own way. Please allow me to leave. Roan didn't stop her. He only nodded and watched her disappear behind the door, with the strange feeling that the story between them was still far from over. She didn't know that only a few hours later, just as she returned to her basement apartment, a call from the hospital would bring down all the pride she had just tried so hard to hold on to, because the nurse on the other end of the line spoke with a trembling voice and said that Pia's condition had suddenly taken a very serious turn for the worse. Marin ran to the hospital as fast as she could, her breath breaking apart, her legs numb as though they no longer belonged to her, and by the time she arrived, the doctors had already moved Pia into the intensive care unit. A female doctor with gentle but serious eyes explained to her that the child's condition had entered a stage where she needed a more specialized form of treatment, a new course the hospital could provide, but the cost was far beyond everything Marin was already carrying, and more important than anything, it had to begin soon in order to give the little girl the best chance. Marin stood outside the glass window, looking in at the place where her sister was being cared for by the nurses, the yellow knit hat still lying neatly beside her pillow, and she pressed her palm against the cold glass, as if that alone might somehow pass her warmth on to Pia. She wasn't allowed to collapse, she told herself. Not now. Not while Pia was still fighting and still needed her to be strong. But fear kept rising in her chest like a tide, icy and impossible to hold back. Because she knew too well that between her and the chance to save her sister, there was only one thing left, and that was money, the one thing she didn't have and didn't know how to find in a few short days. She thought of Roan Whitaker's offer, the one she had refused only hours earlier, and her pride felt like a handful of ashes in the wind. But then she pushed the thought away, because accepting a job was one thing, while holding out her hand and asking for a large sum of money from a powerful stranger was something else entirely. And she wasn't desperate enough for that yet. There was still one place she could try first, though the thought alone made her stomach twist. The next morning, she returned to Ashmont, not to work, but to find Garrett Vance, because even though he had been fired, he was still there to finish packing his belongings, and he was the only one who had ever spoken about advancing the money he had withheld from employees. She found him in his old office, stuffing things into a cardboard box, and when he saw her, a malicious smile spread across his lips. Marin drew in a deep breath, cast aside all the pride she had struggled so hard to hold on to for so long, and for the first time in her life, she knelt before a person she despised. "Please," she said, her voice breaking even though she tried to hold it steady. "My sister needs urgent treatment. I know you've been withholding part of my pay these past few months. I'm only asking you to give that back to me, or advance it to me. I'll do anything to repay it. Please." She's only 9 years old. Garrett looked down at her, and instead of the slightest trace of compassion, his eyes gleamed with the pleasure of a man who had found one last chance to pour out his anger. "So now you know how to humble yourself," he said, his voice stretching out with venom. "Yesterday, up there, you were standing so straight, letting the big boss defend you. Why don't you go up there and ask him for money?" Marin bit down hard on her lip, swallowing the humiliation that was rising into her throat. "I'm not asking him," she said softly. "I'm asking you." Garrett bent down until his eyes were level with hers, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I don't have anything for you," he hissed. "You and that little girl mean nothing to me. And you know what? Seeing you kneel here like this is worth more than any wages I ever held back." Those words struck her like a bucket of cold water thrown straight into her face, and Marin sprang to her feet, both hands trembling, tears spilling over even though she had fought them to the very end. She didn't say another word. She only turned and hurried out of the room, carrying with her the shame and fear that were tearing her chest apart, never knowing that at the very moment she thought she had reached the deepest bottom of despair, somewhere else in the city, an invisible hand had already begun to change everything. When Marin returned to the hospital that afternoon, her heart heavy and her mind hollow because she still hadn't found any way out, the woman at the reception desk called her back with a look she couldn't quite understand, half stunned and half happy on her behalf. "Miss Holt," the woman said, "the entire cost of your sister's treatment has been paid in full, and the new course of treatment has been paid for in advance as well." Marin stood frozen, feeling as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly tilted. She asked again, thinking she must have misheard. And when they confirmed a second time that there was no debt left, that Pia could begin treatment immediately, her knees nearly gave way beneath the weight of her relief. But right after that wave of relief came a cold question rising inside her. Who had done this? She pressed the woman at the desk for an answer, but they only shook their heads and said the benefactor wished to remain anonymous, that everything had been arranged through a law office. Marin didn't need a name to know. In this whole city, there was only one person who knew her situation, had enough power to wipe away an enormous debt with a single nod, and had a reason to do it without letting her know. That evening, she stood before the entrance of the Whitaker building, still in her old clothes, her heart pounding hard, and when Marcus brought her upstairs, she walked into Roan's office, carrying a storm of emotions she couldn't even name. He was standing by the glass window with his back turned to her, and when he heard her footsteps, he slowly turned around. "It was you, wasn't it?" she said, her voice trembling. "You paid Pia's hospital bills." Roan didn't deny it. He only gave a slight nod, and that calmness made the emotions inside her break open all at once. "Why?" she asked, tears beginning to roll down her face. "I told you I didn't need your pity. I turned you down, and still you went behind my back and did this, as if I were a beggar with no right to choose. Do you know what you've just taken from me?" She nearly choked on the words, both hands clenched tight. "I have nothing left except my dignity. And now, even that, you wouldn't let me keep." Roan stepped closer to her, and for the first time in all the times they had met, the coldness on his face disappeared completely, revealing something far more bare and unguarded. "I didn't do it to make you feel small," he said, his voice deep and slow. "I did it because I know what it feels like to stand there watching someone you love need help while you're powerless and can't do anything. I've stood in that place, Marin. You're not the only one the world has turned its back on." His words made her go still, her anger stopping halfway through its rise, because she heard something in his voice that was too real to be an act. "I don't need you to thank me," he went on. "I don't need you to owe me anything. If you want to, you can pretend I never did anything at all. But I won't apologize for saving a child when I had the power to do it." Marin looked at him for a long time, and in that moment, the wall she had built between them began to crack. She was still hurt, still proud, but behind all of that, she was simply a sister who was grateful to the deepest part of her soul because her little sister had been saved. "That child is all I have," she said softly, her voice gentler now. "After my parents died, she was the only reason I kept trying. If I lost her too, I don't know what I'd have left." Roan looked at her, and something in his eyes stirred faintly, just as it had on that first night in the penthouse hallway. "Then you still have her," he said quietly. "And you don't have to carry this alone anymore." In the days that followed, something between Marin and Roan began to change, slowly and quietly, like ice melting beneath the first sunlight of spring. He was no longer the frightening shadow of power she had once tried to avoid, and she stopped looking at him with the guarded eyes of someone always waiting for the worst to happen. One evening, he invited her to his house by the lake on the outskirts, a quiet place completely unlike the coldness of the skyscrapers. And there, for the first time, he told her about the real person behind the name Roan Whitaker. He hadn't been born into silk and luxury the way people rumored, he said, his eyes fixed on the lake reflecting the sunset. He had grown up in the poorest neighborhood on the east side of the city, in a cramped apartment where the winters were so cold that he and his mother had to sleep under the same thin blanket. His father had left when he was too young to remember his face, leaving his mother alone to work 3 jobs at once just to keep the 2 of them from being thrown into the street. He told her about the day his mother fell ill, about how she needed treatment and no one was willing to help, about the doors that slammed shut in front of a poor boy who ran everywhere begging, and about the way the whole world had taught him a cruel lesson, that when he had nothing in his hands, the life of the person he loved meant nothing to anyone. "My mother died when I was 15, he said, his voice still even, yet carrying a faint crack that only someone truly listening could hear. And I swore I'd never let myself fall into that kind of helplessness again. He had climbed upward, 1 step at a time, doing things he wasn't proud of, becoming a man this entire city had to fear because he believed power was the only thing that could keep people from trampling him again." Marin listened in silence, and when he finished, she understood why he had seen something in her from the very beginning, because both of them, in different ways, had once been children the world believed weren't worth listening to. "I think," she said softly after a while, "that the man who saved my sister without needing anyone to know isn't as frightening as you still believe you are." Roan turned to look at her, and in his eyes was a tenderness that perhaps even he had forgotten he still carried. In the days that followed, Marin divided her time between the hospital and the conversations with Roan that came more and more often, and with each passing day, Pia grew a little stronger. The little girl responded well to the new treatment. Color returned to her cheeks, and her laughter began to ring again inside the hospital room that had once been so quiet. One afternoon, when Marin came to visit, Pia showed her sister a new drawing, and this time there was one more person in the picture, a tall man standing beside the little house with a chimney. "Who is this?" Marin asked, smiling. "It's the man who helped me get better," Pia answered innocently, even though she had never met Roan and only knew about him through what her sister had told her. "I drew him standing beside our house, so he wouldn't have to stand alone anymore." When Marin told Roan about it the next evening, she saw that calm man fall silent for a long time, and he had to turn his face toward the lake, because the innocent words of a child who had never even met him had touched the very place that all those years of power and money had never been able to reach. "I didn't know she would say that," Marin said softly, a little embarrassed. "Don't apologize," Roan replied, his voice rougher than usual. "It's been a very long time since anyone drew me standing beside a home." And in that moment, beneath the orange-gold sunset fading slowly over the lake, both of them understood that something fragile but real had begun to grow between them, something built not on pity or debt, but on the understanding of 2 souls that had once been broken in the same way. While something warm was gradually growing in Roan's life, on the other side of his world, a storm was quietly gathering. The name Sloane Brant, which Marcus had once mentioned that morning in the Ashmont basement, now became a shadow hanging over every one of his meetings. Sloane was a sharp and cold woman, a force that had rooted itself deep in the city's dark corners from the time Roan's father still held power, and she represented everything that belonged to the old way built on threats, on blood and fear, the very thing Roan was determined to leave behind. Their meeting took place in a private room of an elegant restaurant, and from the moment Sloane stepped inside, the air thickened as if a storm were about to break. She sat down across from Roan, placed her leather gloves on the table, and gave him a smile that never reached her eyes. "I hear you're cleaning up your empire, Roan," she said, her voice sweet yet sharp as a knife. "Turning the things that made your family name into clean companies and legal contracts. If your father were still alive, I doubt he would recognize his own son anymore." Roan looked at her calmly, not shaken in the least. "My father died because of the world you're trying to hold on to," he replied. "I have no intention of following that road. Times have changed, Sloane. People don't need to spread fear to survive anymore." Sloane let out a laugh, soft and cold. "Naive," she said. "Do you think you can withdraw from this game peacefully? Power doesn't work that way, my boy. Once you let go, dozens of men will push in to seize what you leave behind, and not all of them are as decent as you seem to think. Some people have done business the old way their entire lives, and they won't let you ruin their livelihood just because you suddenly want to become a good man." Those words carried a threat that didn't need to be hidden, and they both understood it clearly. "I'm not afraid of you," Roan said, his voice still never rising. "And I won't change my decision." Sloane stood, picked up her gloves, and before leaving, she stopped beside him, leaned close, and lowered her voice. "Every man has a weakness, Roan," she said. Your father once thought he was untouchable too, until people found the thing he couldn't afford to lose. I wonder what your weakness is." Then she walked away, leaving a warning hanging in the air behind her like the smell of gunpowder. After Sloane had left the room, Roan remained there alone with Marcus, and he didn't notice that his longtime associate was watching the closed door with an unusually thoughtful look. For many years, Marcus had always been his loyal right hand, the man behind every decision, the man who knew every secret. But Roan's recent changes had begun to make something inside him quietly crack. Making the empire legal meant cutting away the sources of profit Marcus had grown used to enjoying for years: the hidden money, the relationships in the shadows, all the things that had built his own private power. "Are you truly planning to see this through to the end?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Roan nodded without the slightest hesitation. "To the end," he answered. "It's time." Marcus smiled and nodded in agreement, but that smile didn't reach his eyes, and in the moment Roan turned away to look out the window. His associate's gaze darkened briefly with a thought he had never dared reveal. A thought that perhaps loyalty had its limits too, and that the price of the change Roan was pursuing might have to be paid by someone else in his place. A few nights later, in a discreet bar on the edge of the city, where the lights were dim and deals were made in the shadows, Marcus Bell sat across from Sloane Brandt with a glass of liquor he hadn't touched. He had been fighting with himself for days, but the resentment that had been smoldering inside him for so long had finally defeated the loyalty he had once believed nothing could shake. "Roan is throwing away everything we built," he said, his voice bitter. "For all those years, I stood behind him and handled the filthiest work, and now he intends to make everything clean and push men like me to the margins, as if we never existed." Sloane listened with the patient smile of a beast that had been waiting for exactly this moment. "So you finally see it," she said softly. "Loyalty is a luxury only fools can afford. I can give you what Roan is about to take from you: power, position, all of it. But I need something from you first." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp and cold. "I need to know his weakness. Every fortress has a crack, and I know Roan Whitaker is no exception." Marcus stayed silent for a long while, and in that final moment, perhaps some part of the old man inside him was still hesitating, still trying to hold on. But then he thought about everything he was about to lose, and that hesitation disappeared. "There's a woman," he said quietly, and the moment those words left his mouth, he knew he had crossed a line he could never step back from. "A maid, named Marin Holt. Roan has never cared about anyone before, never had any weakness. But she's different. He paid her sister's hospital bills, took her to the house by the lake, told her things he'd never told anyone. I've never seen him like that with anybody. If you want to find the crack in Roan, then she's it." Sloane leaned back in her chair, and the smile on her lips widened into something almost satisfied. "A maid," she repeated, as if tasting each word. "The most powerful man in the city, the one no one can touch. Let his heart fall into the hands of a housekeeper." She gave a small shake of her head, amused and contemptuous all at once. Times really have changed. Marcus looked at her, and for the first time, a chill ran down his spine, because he understood that he had just placed in this woman's hands not only a name, but the fate of an innocent person. "You won't hurt her, will you?" he asked, and even to his own ears, the question sounded weak. "I only need her to force Roan to sit at the negotiating table on my terms," Sloane replied, but her eyes offered no comfort at all. "The rest is none of your concern. You've gotten what you wanted. Now let me handle my part." Marcus stood and left, his heart heavy with a feeling he tried not to call regret, and when the bar door closed behind him, he didn't know that he had just lit the fuse on a chain of events that would sweep everything away. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the city, Marin was still living through those rare, peaceful days. She had just returned from the hospital after seeing Pia's radiant smile, her heart filled with hope for a future she dared to dream of for the first time in many years, completely unaware that her name had just been whispered in the dark, and that from this moment on, she had become a pawn in a game she had never chosen to enter. Sloane Brandt had what she needed, and now the final link in the perfect trap lay neatly in her hands, waiting only for the right moment to tighten. The trap was laid on an evening that seemed as ordinary as any other. Marin received a call from an unfamiliar number, and the voice of a woman who claimed to be an employee from the law office that had arranged Pia's hospital fees told her there were several documents she needed to sign to complete the paperwork, and that they had sent a car to pick her up at an address near her apartment. Marin hesitated, but the offer sounded reasonable, and partly because she was worried about the procedures related to her sister. She agreed. Only after the car had been moving for a while, heading in the wrong direction from downtown and turning onto increasingly deserted roads on the edge of the city, did she realize something wasn't right. The man in the front seat didn't answer when she asked where they were going, and the car doors were locked tight. Her heart pounded, but in the middle of her fear, a part of her mind, the part forged through years of having to protect herself, still tried to keep her clear-headed. She didn't scream. She didn't struggle uselessly. Instead, she began quietly observing everything around her, memorizing every turn, every sign that flashed past the window, silently counting the time so she could estimate the distance. The car finally stopped in front of an old abandoned warehouse by the water, and she was taken inside, where a woman was already waiting with a cold smile, someone Marin had never met, yet instantly sensed was the person behind it all. "You must be Marin," the woman said, her eyes sweeping over her from head to toe with curiosity mixed with contempt. "I have to admit, I imagined someone different. It's hard to believe an ordinary girl like you could soften Roan Whitaker's heart." Marin didn't answer. She only kept her gaze as calm as possible, though inside, worry was gnawing at her. Not worry for herself, but for Pia, the little sister lying safely in the hospital, knowing nothing about what was happening, and Marin silently prayed that, whatever happened to her, the child would remain safe there. She understood that this woman wanted to use her as a chess piece to pressure Roan, and she knew the only way she might have a chance was to buy time, to make them believe she had surrendered while secretly searching for every possible way to leave a trace. As she was led through the warehouse, she pretended to stagger with fear, so she would have an excuse to touch the wall and the crates, leaving fingerprints behind and dragging her shoes to create faint marks in the layer of dust. She quietly removed the cloth bracelet Pia had braided for her, the only thing she always carried with her, and when no one was watching, she dropped it into a hidden corner near the entrance, like a breadcrumb leading the way in the fairy tale she used to tell her sister. Through the gap of a broken window, she noticed an old sign from a shipyard that had long since shut down, and she carved that name into her memory. When the woman ordered her to call Roan and say she was being held, Marin pretended to tremble and obey, but in the few short sentences before the phone was snatched from her hand, she managed to slip in a detail that seemed meaningless, mentioning the smell of seawater and the sound of ship horns, enough for someone as sharp as Roan to trace her to the old port district. The woman gave a scornful laugh, believing she had the entire situation under control, never knowing that the prey she thought was weak had quietly scattered small clues everywhere. Marin sat down in the corner of the cold warehouse, wrapped her arms around her knees, and amid the darkness closing in around her, she told herself she had to be strong, had to survive, not only for herself, but for an unfinished promise to make cookies with a little girl waiting for her sister to come home. She didn't know whether Roan would find her in time, but she had done everything a person in her situation could do, and now all she could do was wait and hope. The moment the call was cut off, Roan shot up from his chair, and his usual calm vanished, giving way to something cold and sharp as a blade. He replayed Marin's final few words over and over in his mind, the smell of seawater, the sound of ship horns, and he immediately understood that she had been trying to tell him where she was being held. "The old port," he said, his voice hardening. "Every abandoned shipyard north of the harbor. Search them one by one." He mobilized his men within minutes, and as the convoy tore through the night, he sat in the front seat with both hands clenched tight, his heart twisting with a fear he hadn't tasted in many years, the fear of losing someone he truly cared about. When they reached the harbor district, his men spread out to inspect each warehouse, and it was Roan himself who found the first clue, a faint dragged shoe mark across the dusty floor near an entrance. And then, lying quietly in a hidden corner, the colorful cloth bracelet he had once seen on Marin's wrist. He picked it up and closed it tightly in his palm, and every doubt disappeared. "She's here," he said softly. The old sign above the door of the shipyard confirmed it, exactly as she had skillfully planted it in his memory. Roan signaled for his men to surround the warehouse, and then he was the first to step inside. Within, Sloane Brant spun around when the door burst open, and the smug smile on her lips stiffened when she saw Roan's figure appear in the doorway. "You came faster than I expected," she said, trying to recover her composure. "But you should consider your next step, Roan. Your girl is here, and you're standing on my ground." Roan didn't look at her. His eyes immediately found Marin sitting in the corner of the warehouse, and when he saw that she was still safe, something in his chest eased, if only for 1 second. "You're mistaken, Sloane," he said, his voice icy. "You think you're holding a hostage, but in truth, you're standing in the middle of my trap." At that very moment, his men rushed in from every side, and the once silent warehouse suddenly broke open with the sound of running footsteps and shouted commands. Sloane's men lunged forward, but they quickly realized they had been outmatched both in number and preparation. There was a brief but violent struggle, shadows colliding in the flickering light, and Roan moved through that chaos with the certainty of a man who knew exactly what he had to do, sweeping aside anyone who blocked his path as he went straight toward Marin. In the midst of it, Marcus emerged from the darkness behind them, the former associate's face pale as he met the eyes of the man he had betrayed. Roan stopped short when he saw him, and for an instant, the pain of betrayal showed plainly on his usually cold face. "It was you," he said, and it wasn't a question. Marcus opened his mouth as if to say something, a justification, an apology, but no words came out, because no words could cover what he had done. Sloane, realizing the game had turned against her, tried to use the moment when Roan was distracted to flee toward the rear exit, but Roan's men had already blocked every way out. From the corner of the warehouse, Marin saw a man charging at Roan from behind, and she shouted a warning to him, her voice tearing through the air. Roan turned in time, dodged the attack, and subdued the man in only a few clean movements. In less than a few minutes, it was all over. Sloane's men were overpowered. Sloane was driven into a corner, and Marcus stood motionless, his head bowed like a man who had lost everything. Roan walked to Marin, knelt beside her, and for the first time since the warehouse door had burst open, his expression softened completely. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, reaching out to help her. Marin nodded, her tears finally spilling over after all the hours she had held them back, and she showed him her bare wrist. "I left the bracelet behind," she said, her voice trembling. "I knew you'd find it." Roan took the colorful bracelet from his coat pocket and gently fastened it back around her wrist. And in that moment, inside the cold warehouse, amid the wreckage of a conspiracy that had just collapsed, the two of them only looked at each other, needing no more words at all. In the days after the night at the Harbor District, Roan didn't choose the kind of revenge his old world had always expected of him. Sloane Brant was used to the rules of violence. She had prepared herself for a bloody war to seize back power, but what Roan brought down on her was a blow she had never seen coming. For many months, he had quietly gathered evidence of every illegal operation Sloane had carried out. The files, the hidden transactions, the testimonies he had carefully kept until the right moment came. And now, instead of dealing with her in the dark the way his father once would have done, he chose to bring everything into the light. He arranged a meeting with the very forces that had once backed Sloane, the people who had supported her all this time, and in front of all of them, he laid out proof, showing that Sloane had betrayed them again and again, quietly draining their shared funds and blaming others in order to strengthen her own position. The room fell silent as each document was presented, and Marin, standing quietly beside Roan, watched Sloane's face change from pride to panic as she realized that the world she had spent her life building was collapsing beneath her feet. The people who had once knelt before her now turned their backs with contempt in their eyes, and the power Sloane had held her entire life vanished, not because of a bullet or a fist, but because of the very truth she had tried so hard to hide. "You taught me one thing, Sloane," Roan said, his voice calm, yet carrying through the room. "Everyone has a weakness. Yours is that you believe fear is the only thing that makes people obey, but fear only holds people as long as they haven't found their courage. And today, everyone in this room has found it." Sloane was cast out by her own side, stripped of everything, and handed over to the law along with all the evidence of her crimes. Garrett Vance, the man who had once believed he could bully the vulnerable without paying a price, didn't escape either. The wrongdoing he had committed throughout his time as manager, from withholding employees' wages to spreading false accusations and fabricated stories, was all exposed, and he was held accountable, his name becoming a stain so deep that no place in the city dared hire him again. As for Marcus, the man who had once been Roan's most trusted associate, he stood before him with all the humiliation of someone who had lost everything because of his own greed and resentment. He didn't beg. He only waited silently for judgment. And when Roan looked at him, what filled the powerful man's eyes wasn't rage, but a deep sorrow. "I considered you a brother," Roan said softly. "You could have come to me and told me you were afraid of losing your place. I could have found a path for you too, but you chose to betray an innocent person. He didn't order Marcus to be punished in the cruel way the old world would have demanded. He only stripped him of everything he had once possessed and let him leave, carrying the weight of betrayal like a sentence heavier than any punishment. That night, standing on the balcony of the house by the lake, Roan confessed to Marin that there had been a moment in the warehouse when he saw her held captive, when he had wanted to do terrible things, had wanted to let the old man inside him rise up and drown everyone who had dared touch her. "What stopped you?" Marin asked softly. Roan turned to look at her, his eyes gentle beneath the moonlight. "You did," he answered. "I realized that if I followed that road, I would become exactly the man I had hated all my life, and I would lose the very reason you look at me the way you do. I spent my whole life believing power meant being able to make others afraid, but you taught me that there is a greater strength, the ability to choose not to do evil when you're fully capable of it." Marin stepped closer and placed her hand over his, and in the stillness of the night, they both understood that the man whose name the whole city had once spoken in fear had now chosen another path, one that was harder but brighter, and that it was love, not revenge, that had finally saved him. That spring, the city of Seattle witnessed a change almost no one could believe. The Whitaker name, once whispered in fear in dark corners, now appeared on the news in an entirely different way. Roan kept his word, bringing his entire empire into the light, turning the underground operations of years past into transparent and legal businesses. But what made people speak of him most wasn't his fortune. It was the foundation he established, a foundation created specifically to protect workers who had been bullied and pushed around. Housekeepers, servers, service employees, the quiet, powerless people who had once been treated as though their voices weren't worth anything at all. Marin stood at the head of that foundation, because no one understood better than she did what it felt like to be backed into a corner, with no one willing to listen, and now she used her own wounds to become a place of support for others. The young woman who had once knelt and begged before a petty man now stood with her back straight, not because she had changed, but because the world had finally begun to see her as the person she had always been. Pia fully recovered after the course of treatment, and the day the little girl was discharged from the hospital became one of the most beautiful days Marin had ever known. She ran out through the hospital doors, still wearing the yellow knit hat on her head, her cheeks rosy and her eyes shining bright, rushing straight into her sister's arms amid the clear sound of laughter. And when Pia saw the tall man standing beside her sister, the man she had once drawn beside the little house with a chimney, she hesitated for a moment, then gave him a radiant smile and reached out her tiny hand to take his. "You're real now," the little girl said, and Roan, the man who had once made the whole city tremble, had to bend down and turn away to hide the sting in his eyes. They returned together to the house by the lake, and that afternoon, just as Marin had promised long ago, the three of them went into the kitchen to bake cookies, flour dusting Pia's hair, laughter filling the house that had once been far too quiet. The relationship between Marin and Roan grew not as a story of a rich man rescuing a poor woman, but as the meeting of two equal souls, two people who had once been broken and who were healing together. She didn't become a shadow beside him, but a true companion, someone who dared to tell him the things no one else dared to say, someone who reminded him who he was on the days he forgot. And Roan, for the first time in his life, understood that a home wasn't a castle guarded by fear, but a place where people saw each other's true worth and chose to stay. Marin Holt's story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that a person's value doesn't lie in their status or the wealth they possess, but in the dignity they manage to keep even through their darkest days, and that every person, no matter how poor or small they may seem, deserves to be seen, heard, and respected as their true self. Sometimes, kindness given at the right moment can change an entire life, and sometimes, the person who seems weakest is the one carrying the greatest power to heal. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love so we can spread meaningful stories together and listen to more compelling stories every day. How do you feel about Marin and Roan's story, and what moved you the most? Please leave a comment below and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we're always hoping to hear what you want to say. Thank you for spending your time listening all the way to the final moment. I wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a joyful life, peace of mind, and calm days always. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.